Imagine you're sitting in the break room of a hospital at 6 in the morning, shoes still damp from a 12-hour shift, when you play a voicemail from a number you don't recognize. A man with a slow Georgia drawl tells you that a woman named Mabel Sutton has died at the age of 87, and that according to her final will and testament, you are the sole heir to 62 acres of farmland in Whitfield County, Georgia. You've never heard the name Mabel Sutton in your life. You don't know a single person in Georgia. Do you call that number back, or do you delete the message and order another coffee? For Joanna Mercer, calling back turned out to be the most important decision she ever made. In January of 2024, Joanna Mercer, 34, was surviving, not living surviving, out of a duffel bag in a sublet room in Memphis, Tennessee. She worked rotating 12-hour shifts as a travel nurse at a regional hospital that smelled of antiseptic and institutional exhaustion, picking up every extra assignment she could find because she had $63,000 in outstanding medical debt from the autoimmune diagnosis she'd received 3 years earlier, and every month the interest crept upward like something slow and patient and deliberate. Her mother, Lillian Mercer, had died from a stroke the previous summer. Joanna had spent her emergency savings on the funeral, and now there was nothing left, just the shifts, the debt, the cracked screen on her phone she couldn't afford to fix. She called the number back. 3 days later, she was sitting across from George Aldrich, 62, a quiet-spoken estate attorney in Dalton, Georgia, who slid a folder across his desk with the careful hands of a man practiced at delivering news that rearranged people's lives. Mabel Sutton passed away 11 days ago, George said. She was 87. She owned the Sutton farm, 62 acres, including the farmhouse, the outbuildings, and the orchard. She has left it entirely to you. The land, the structures, all contents. Joanna stared at the folder. There's been a mistake. I've never heard of Mabel Sutton. She was very specific. George turned the folder so Joanna could see the top page. She provided your full name, your date of birth, and your mother's maiden name. She wanted it understood there was no ambiguity. Joanna looked up slowly, her mother's maiden name. What was her connection to my family? George folded his hands. That I can't tell you. Mabel didn't explain her relationship to you in any legal document. What I can tell you is that the estate is valued at approximately $1.2 million, and that there is a stipulation. There was always a stipulation. Before the deed transfers to your name, and before you may sell or transfer the property, you must reside on the premises continuously for 45 days. If you leave for more than 24 consecutive hours at any point, the estate defaults to the Sutton Family Historical Foundation. George removed his glasses. I want to be honest with you, Miss Mercer. The farmhouse has been unoccupied for 12 years. It's in significant disrepair. Cell coverage is unreliable. The property taxes have been maintained through a trust Mabel established for that purpose, so there are no arrears. But the structure itself has not been maintained. She was deliberate about this stipulation. I believe she wanted whoever inherited to understand what they were taking on. Joanna looked at the valuation sheet, did the math. Where do I sign? She said. She drove south on I-75 with her duffel in the back seat and the folder on the passenger seat. The GPS worked fine until she turned off the county road onto a one-lane track of packed red Georgia clay, at which point it refreshed 3 times and told her to make a U-turn into a ditch. She followed George's printed directions instead, counting off the turns by hand. The entrance to the Sutton farm was marked by a pair of old stone gateposts that had settled at slightly different angles over the years, like 2 old men leaning away from each other. The iron gate between them hung open, the hinges furred with rust. A small bronze plate on the right-hand post read Stunton Farm, EST, 1902. Joanna pulled through and stopped. The orchard spread on both sides of the drive. Peach trees, dormant in January, their bare branches grey and reaching like the arms of people asking for something. The ground between them was hard frozen, scattered with the split skins of last autumn's fallen fruit. now black and collapsed into the clay. The smell that drifted through the car vents was faintly sweet and mostly rot. At the end of the drive sat the farmhouse. It had been white once. The paint had surrendered in long strips that revealed the dry grey wood beneath. The porch sagged on the left side. One upper window was boarded from the inside with a piece of cardboard. The whole structure had the quality of something that had been slowly drawing inward for years, retreating from itself. Joanna cut the engine. The silence after it was the absolute silence of rural winter. She stepped out and heard a voice. "You're not what I expected." She turned. A man was standing at the far corner of the barn, an enormous dark structure set 20 yards behind the house. He was in his early 70s, lean and deeply weathered, with a hunting rifle slung over one shoulder, barrel down. "Cecil Dawes," the man said, walking toward her without hurry. "I've been keeping watch on this place since Mabel got too frail to walk the perimeter herself. She didn't tell me your name." "Joanna Mercer, I'm the heir." Cecil stopped 10 feet away and studied her with the calm, unhurried appraisal of someone who spent their life sizing up things that mattered. Land, weather, intentions. "Your grandmother's name was Frances," he said. "Not a question." Joanna went very still, yes. Then Mabel knew what she was doing. He looked past her at the house, and something in his expression went through a brief internal shift. "One thing. Don't go into the northwest corner of the barn after dark. The floor there is unstable. I've been meaning to address it for 2 years. Until I do, stay clear." He turned and walked back toward the tree line and disappeared into it. The first week was a lesson in being alone. No internet. Cell service required leaning out the upstairs bathroom window at a precise angle, holding the phone above her head and hoping. The furnace ran somewhere between lukewarm and barely present, and Joanna slept in her coat the first 3 nights. She inventoried the house room by room, partly practical, partly a way to keep her mind off the sounds the old structure made at night, which were varied and too deliberate sounding for a building supposedly empty. On the 4th day, at the end of the 2nd-floor hallway, she found the door. Narrow, a linen closet, or maybe a small room repurposed into storage. What stopped Joanna was not the door, but the padlock. A heavy brass padlock mounted on a hasp, locked from the outside. You locked something from the outside to preserve what was in it, to protect it from the world rather than the world from it. She went to the mudroom, found bolt cutters on a hook by the back door, and spent 4 minutes working through the shackle. Inside was a sewing room, or had been. A treadle machine stood in the corner beneath a linen cloth, but the walls stopped her cold. Photographs, dozens of them in mismatched frames, covering nearly every inch of available space. Candid shots, formal portraits, pictures of the farm in different seasons across what looked like decades. All of it organized with the quiet, meticulous care of someone who had loved these images deeply and wanted them to survive. In the center of the south wall, at eye level, was a single-framed photograph positioned with obvious deliberateness. Joanna stepped closer. 2 young women, around 20 years old, standing in the orchard when it was still alive and full, and covered in peach blossoms. They were laughing, the real kind, heads tilted toward each other, unself-conscious. One had the high cheekbones and sharp eyes that Joanna recognized from Mabel Sutton's estate documents. The other one made Joanna reach out and grip the doorframe. The other woman had her grandmother's face. Exactly. The particular tilt of the chin, the crinkle at the outer corners of the eyes, the way the smile pulled slightly more to the left than the right. Frances. Joanna's grandmother, who had died in 1989, 35 years before Joanna stood in this room. Her grandmother, who had never mentioned Georgia, never mentioned a farm, never mentioned a woman named Mabel. On the back of the photograph, in ink faded to brown, Frances and Mabel, summer of 1958, before Raymond made everything harder. Joanna sat down on the floor of the sewing room and stayed there for a long time. She almost didn't hear the truck. It was the sound of tires on gravel that pulled her back. A vehicle coming up the drive faster than it should. Through the sewing room's small window, she watched a black SUV pull to an aggressive stop near the porch. The man who stepped out was in his mid-40s, expensive coat, shoes that had never seen red clay. He walked with the particular pace of someone accustomed to arriving places and having that arrival matter. Joanna met him at the front door with the chain engaged. "Mrs. Mercer." He offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Brendan Sutton. Mabel was my great-aunt." George Aldrich didn't mention any living family. George Aldrich is a careful man who does what he's told. Brendan set his briefcase on the porch railing, undid the latches, and turned it toward her. Banded stacks of cash, dense and neat. $300,000. "I'm not here to contest the will. I'm here to offer you a practical exit. Take the money, leave tonight, and the historical foundation gets the land. You walk away clear of that medical debt." The medical debt. Joanna felt something cold move through her chest. "How do you know about my medical debt?" she asked. "I do my research." Brendan's tone didn't sharpen, exactly, but something behind his eyes changed. "You drove down from Memphis 4 days ago. You don't know this place, Miss Mercer. I've known it my whole life. Take $300,000 and go home." "I don't have a home," Joanna said. "That's why I'm here." She closed the door. She heard him stand on the porch for a moment, then the briefcase latches snapping shut, then the crunch of tires on gravel as he left. She went and sat at the kitchen table in the failing winter light and thought about that number in real terms. What it would mean, the debt zeroed out, the medication she'd been rationing, the ability to sleep a full night without running calculations. She thought about how long she'd been living out of a bag, and how tired she was, and how this house was cold and broken, and full of someone else's history. She sat there until dark. But the thing she kept coming back to was not the money. It was the fact that Brendan Sutton had found her, had researched her specifically, had come prepared with the exact number that might make her leave. That kind of preparation didn't come from a man who wanted a family heirloom. It came from a man who was afraid of what she'd find. She got up and lit the kitchen lamp. She had reading to do. In the cedar chest at the back of the sewing room, beneath a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, was a journal with cracked leather covers, Mabel's handwriting, small and slanted, filling every page to the margins. Joanna read it by lamplight over 3 nights. By the time she finished, she understood why a woman she'd never met had left her 62 acres of Georgia clay. In the summer of 1958, Raymond Sutton had been a deputy with the Whitfield County Sheriff's Office, and a man who understood ownership as a function entirely of his own desire. Over 2 years, he had quietly redirected $143,000 from the county evidence lockup, seized cash from gambling and bootlegging operations, money that was supposed to be turned over to the state. He brought it to the farm and told Mabel she would keep her mouth shut about it and about everything else, or she would learn in specific and permanent terms what happened to women who didn't. Frances was visiting that August weekend. Joanna's grandmother, 22 years old, a schoolteacher from Dalton, had driven out as she often did. She was there the Saturday evening when Raymond came home having had too much to drink and decided that Mabel's compliance needed reinforcing. Mabel had written about what followed in plain, careful language, without embellishment. Raymond went for Mabel. Frances picked up the cast-iron pan from the stovetop. The impact was significant. Raymond went down the back porch stairs in a way that the human body is not designed to accommodate. By the time they understood he wasn't going to get up, it was past midnight. The nearest help was the county sheriff's office, which was Raymond's office, his friends. They buried him before dawn in the northwest corner of the barn floor. They told everyone Raymond had left. Every person who knew Raymond found this entirely plausible. Joanna set the journal down and looked at the lamp flame. Her grandmother had done this, had been part of this, and then driven home to Dalton and never said a word to anyone, and lived out her life and died without anyone knowing. Joanna thought about the photograph in the sewing room, those two young women laughing in the blossoms, and tried to hold both things at once. The laughter and the barn floor, the friendship that had kept a secret for 30 years until Francis was gone, and Mabel was alone with it for 30 more. She wasn't horrified. That was the thing she kept turning over. She was something more complicated than horrified. At the back of the journal, in the most recent entry dated 3 weeks before Mabel's death, in a shaking elderly hand, there was a 6-digit number. Below it, 3 sentences. The chamber beneath the barn has been sealed for 66 years. The combination is above. Do not let Brendan have what is inside. Now, if you were sitting in that farmhouse, having just read this journal, would you go to the barn, or would you walk out the front door, drive back to Memphis, and let the lawyers sort through the shadows? There's no wrong answer. But Joanna Mercer had just turned down $300,000. She wasn't finished yet. She waited until afternoon, when the light was still good. She brought the flashlight from the mudroom and the pry bar she'd found near the water heater, and she walked across the frozen ground to the barn. It was enormous and dark inside, the cold air carrying decades of undisturbed stillness. She moved to the northwest corner, where Cecil had told her to stay away from. A rusted tractor sat positioned against the far wall, not because anyone had been using it, she understood now, but because of what it covered. She worked the pry bar under the tractor's front axle, levering it sideways across the frozen earth until she had clearance to see the planks beneath. They were different from the rest of the barn floor. Newer wood, replaced sometime in the early 1960s from the look of it, sunk flush and nailed tight. She pried them up one by one. Beneath was a poured concrete subfloor with a steel hatch set into it, roughly the size of a car trunk, fitted with a lever handle and a combination lock. The 6-digit number from the journal opened it on the first try. The hatch swung up on counterbalanced hinges, well maintained, recently greased. Someone had been keeping this secret intact. Below, a chamber, 8 feet deep, with an iron ladder bolted to the wall, she climbed down. 4 military surplus ammunition crates, padlocked, a canvas bag, and on the floor beside the base of the ladder, a sealed envelope of heavy cream paper, addressed in faded fountain pen ink. Whoever Francis trusted enough to send here. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet covered in a man's cramped, urgent writing. It took her a moment to fully understand what she was reading. Raymond Sutton had written this, had been alive, barely, long enough to write it. Some survival instinct, some final accounting. The handwriting grew shakier as the letter went on. He described what he'd taken from the county lockup, where he'd hidden it, and the Federal Reserve serial numbers registered against the bills. He described what he had done to Mabel over 4 years of marriage. At the very end, in letters that were nearly illegible, she was right to fight back. Don't let them take the farm. Joanna was still reading when the barn doors above her slammed open. She found the hatch. Brendan's voice, calm in the particular way that is worse than anger. Footsteps on the barn floor, 2 sets. Miss Mercer, I can see the hatch is open. Come up. I need Raymond's letter and the combination log. Hand those up to me and I'll leave you in peace. Joanna pressed herself against the chamber wall beneath the lip of the opening. She looked around. In the back wall, nearly obscured by shadow, was a second opening. Low and narrow, maybe 2 feet square, covered by a wooden panel. An old ventilation shaft or a drain access, cut into the chamber long before the barn floor was poured over it. She had no idea where it led. She put Raymond's letter in her jacket pocket. She crossed to the panel, pulled it free, and pressed herself into the opening. It was tight, utterly dark, and smelled of clay and old root systems. She crawled on her elbows, pushing forward steadily, for what felt much longer than it probably was. Something cold soaked through the knees of her jeans. She kept moving. The panel at the far end was latched from inside. She hit it once with her palm. It swung outward. She tumbled into the grey January light at the back of the barn, behind a tangle of rusted equipment and dead kudzu. She got to her feet and ran. She knew where she was going. She'd spent 3 weeks walking this property, mapping it the way you do when you're alone and need something to do. The old stone cistern at the northwest edge of the orchard, predating the farmhouse, its wooden cover swallowed over decades by kudzu until it was invisible unless you knew precisely where to look. She'd found it on day 6, nearly stepped through the rotted planks, backed away carefully. She had not forgotten it. She could hear Brendan and the other man coming around the far side of the barn. She moved between the bare peach trees, counting rows, the frozen ground solid under her boots. At the 5th row, she cut hard north toward the fence line. She could see the depression in the earth where the cistern sat, the dead kudzu mounded over the covered frame like a sleeping animal. She circled it wide, putting it between herself and Brendan's direction, and stopped. She threw a dead branch hard to her right. It cracked against a tree trunk, loud, sharp. Brendan's hired man went right, flashlight swinging. Brendan kept coming straight. Joanna held still. Brendan came through the trees at a run, eyes fixed on the space where she'd been standing. He hit the kudzu mound at full stride. The rotted frame gave way without resistance, and he dropped into the cistern with a sound Joanna felt in her chest. A short, terrible impact, then silence, then a sustained groan from somewhere below. The hired man spun toward the sound, skidded to the edge, and shone his light down. Joanna was already running for the house. Cecil was standing in the barn doorway when she came back around the front. He had his phone in his hand. He looked at her with the steady expression of a man who had been waiting for something for a very long time, and was not surprised to see it arrive. "State Police," he said. "Called them 20 minutes ago when I saw Brendan's truck. I've been watching this place since the day you arrived." He paused. "I should have done something about this 66 years ago. I was 18, and I was afraid of what it would cost me. I'm not 18 anymore." The state police found Brendan Sutton at the bottom of the old cistern, with a fractured wrist and a great deal to explain. His associate was apprehended at the county road. George drove out that evening and stayed while investigators documented the chamber, the crates, Raymond's letter, Mabel's journal. The process was careful and thorough, and, for Joanna, strangely necessary, as if everything had needed to be opened to the air before anything else could happen. The cash in the crates, $143,000 in bills from 1958, serials on the federal record, was forfeited to the state. The investigation into Brendan uncovered a secondary fraud. He had been filing falsified documentation with the Sutton Family Historical Foundation for over a decade, siphoning endowment funds toward land acquisitions he was running through the foundation's name. He was charged on 9 counts. Because of Joanna's cooperation and her status as legal heir, the state awarded her a substantial finder's fee for the recovered assets and the information that led to Brendan's prosecution. It was not enough to be wealthy. It was enough to be free. She paid the $63,000 in medical debt in a single transfer on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the kitchen table of the farmhouse, and then sat very still for a while because she couldn't think of a single thing she urgently needed to do next. She almost reached for her phone to call her mother before she remembered she couldn't. Cecil told her the rest of it over 2 evenings in the kitchen, with the furnace finally running properly and coffee on the stove. He had been 18 in 1958, an assistant to the county clerk, when he came out to take a report on Raymond Sutton's disappearance. He had seen the disturbed earth near the barn, the bruise on Mabel's cheekbone, the way Francis's hands wouldn't stop moving. He had written a report describing Raymond as a likely voluntary abandonment, a man who had walked away of his own accord, which was what the whole county believed, and what most of them were quietly relieved to hear. "Did you know?" Joanna asked. "What really happened?" "I knew enough," Cecil said. "Raymond broke 3 of Mabel's father's fingers the year before. When her father came out to check on her, the county did nothing. Raymond was the county. He wrapped both hands around his mug. I decided some things didn't require investigating." You came out here every day for 66 years over a decision you made at 18. More or less. He looked at the table for a moment. I cared about her. That's the longer answer. In the spring, Joanna hired 2 men from Dalton to help clear the barn and prep the orchard for replanting. She spent evenings reading about heirloom peach varieties, writing down questions for the Agricultural Extension Office, learning things she had never thought she would need to know. The farmhouse took longer. The porch re-leveled, the furnace replaced, the upper windows reglazed. She did most of the interior work herself, on weekends, room by room. She left the photograph of Francis and Mabel in its place on the sewing room wall. She filed for a Georgia nursing license in April. She started part-time shifts at the Dalton Hospital in May. It was less work than Memphis had been, and it was enough. Cecil moved his truck from the Ridge Road, where he'd parked it every evening for 3 decades, and parked it in the driveway instead. Nobody formally discussed this. It simply became, without ceremony, the way things were. The peach trees Joanna planted that first spring were dwarf varieties, compact, designed to bear fruit within 2 or 3 seasons. She didn't know yet how long she intended to stay. She had learned not to plan too far ahead. But when the trees leafed out in April, pale green against the red clay, she stood between the rows in the early morning and thought about 2 22-year-old women laughing in a peach orchard in the summer of 1958, not knowing what August would bring, just glad to be standing there together in the blossoms. She thought her grandmother would have liked it here. She thought maybe Francis had known she would. Joanna Mercer arrived at the Sutton farm with nothing but debt, a cracked phone screen, and a name written in a dead woman's will. She left the next chapter of her life there, not as a stranger passing through, but as someone who had finally stopped moving. She uncovered a 66-year secret, outran a man through a January orchard, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, found herself standing still for the first time in years. Not because she had nowhere left to go, but because she'd found somewhere worth staying. What would you have done? Would you have taken Brendan's $300,000 and driven back to Memphis? The practical choice, the safe one, the choice that let you sleep. Or would you have climbed down into that chamber and read what Raymond left behind? Drop a comment below and tell us. If this story stayed with you, hit like and share it, and subscribe to Own the Drama. We're here every week with the stories that don't make the headlines, but stay with you long after they're over.